Fetal alcohol syndrome is a syndrome that occurs when a developing fetus is exposed to alcohol in utero. So, because of mom consuming alcohol while she's pregnant. And for someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, being exposed to alcohol like this while they're growing inside mom here, well, this results in intellectual disabilities and some characteristic physical features, and we'll talk more about those in a sec here. But before we get more into these signs of fetal alcohol syndrome, let's actually check out a bit more about how mom consuming alcohol can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. So when mom consumes alcohol while she's pregnant, what actually happens is that this alcohol can make its way to the developing fetus here. Because remember, the fetus gets all of its blood, all of its oxygen and nutrients from mom via the umbilical cord, which we can see here. So this is what connects the fetus to mom. It's like a lifeline. So when mom drinks alcohol, this alcohol that she consumes, it floats around in her bloodstream and can make its way to the fetus here because the fetus is sharing blood with mom. And when the fetus is exposed to alcohol like this, it actually interferes with the fetus's growth and can actually damage the fetus's developing brain and cause the intellectual disabilities that we see in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome. Now, at the moment, we aren't entirely sure exactly how this alcohol causes intellectual disabilities. We don't quite know all the details yet, but we do have a clue. So we know that the neurons in the developing fetus, the neurons in the brain of the developing fetus, are really, really sensitive. These neurons are really young. They're really easily damaged. And we know that alcohol can actually destroy these neurons as they're trying to grow and build their complex networks with the other neurons in the brain. These networks that neurons use to communicate with each other so that our brain can function and do its job. So what we think is happening is that the neurons in the brain of our fetus here, when they die because of exposure to alcohol from mom, the brain isn't able to grow and develop normally. And that's what causes the intellectual disabilities that we see in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome. Now you might be thinking, well, how come the fetus isn't able to break alcohol down like we can? Isn't that what the liver is for, to prevent alcohol toxicity, to break it down? And you're right, that is what the liver is for. But it turns out that the fetus, its liver, doesn't actually have those enzymes yet, the enzymes that we need to break down alcohol. Those come later in life. So that means that the alcohol that the fetus is exposed to builds up really, really fast inside the fetus because it isn't being broken down, right? And to make matters worse, these neurons in the fetus's brain, they're still really delicate, right? They're still developing. They're very easily damaged. So they can die really easily when they're exposed to something like alcohol. So now that we have a bit better of an idea of how fetal alcohol syndrome occurs in the first place, let's actually take a better look at what fetal alcohol syndrome is, what the signs and symptoms are. So the main sort of feature of fetal alcohol syndrome is brain damage, and this happens because those delicate neurons are dying when they're exposed to alcohol. And if we were to look inside the brain of someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, we might see a few different abnormalities because of this loss of neurons. So, for example, we might see that this part of the brain here, called the corpus callosum, which is really important for allowing the two different halves, the two different hemispheres of our brain to talk to each other, to communicate. Well, in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, what we can see here is the corpus callosum can actually be partially or completely lost. And we call this agenesis. And agenesis means that the structure, so in this case the corpus callosum, it didn't form properly because some of those neurons, they died. So since the corpus callosum is really important for these hemispheres of our brain to be able to communicate with each other, some of the things that we can see when the corpus callosum is lost is we can see things like trouble with learning, trouble with communication, and sometimes seizures. And if we check out this part of the brain here called the cerebellum, which is really important for things like helping us move and balance and coordinate our body parts, in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, sometimes the neurons in the cerebellum can die. And this results in what we call cerebellar hypoplasia, where hypo means under and plasia means formation. So under formation of the cerebellum. So if this was the damage that we saw in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, well, you can imagine that the person might have trouble with movements, trouble coordinating their body parts and balancing. And if we were to shade in the frontal cortex here, and let's also shade in some of the memory centers, maybe let's shade in the hippocampus, for example. Well, these areas, they help us with things like memory, learning, communicating. So if these were the areas where the neurons were lost in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome because of exposure to alcohol, well, that's where we might see the person having trouble with their memory, trouble with learning, trouble with communicating. So these are just a few examples of some of the types of brain damage that we can see in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, and then some of the intellectual disabilities that can occur when those delicate neurons are lost in these areas. So while brain damage and intellectual disability are the main sort of features of fetal alcohol syndrome, there are actually also some physical characteristics that we can see in people with fetal alcohol syndrome. So let's check out one of these by drawing a growth chart here. So let's just put age down the bottom here. So let's look at the ages of 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then let's put height on the y-axis here, and we'll do that in inches. So I'm going to draw these lines here that are what we call percentiles. So for example, let's draw this line here, and this is the 5th percentile. So if we were to look at the age of 2 here, and we line this up with this line, and we saw what the height was, we would see that the corresponding height value is 32 inches. And this is actually for boys, I should mention. So for 2 years old, if we look at the 5th percentile line here, we see that the value is 32 inches. So what does that mean? Well, this means that if a 2-year-old is 32 inches tall, they're at the 5th percentile. So 5% of other 2-year-olds are the same or shorter height than them. And 95% of other 2-year-olds are taller. So that means that the vast majority of kids this age are taller than this kid. 95% actually. So this kid would be pretty short for their age. So let's draw a few more lines here. So this is the 10th percentile line and the 50th and the 90th. So we could look at these different ages and line them up with these different lines here and see which heights corresponded to these different percentiles for these ages. So by looking at a kid's age and their height, we can figure out how they compare to other kids their age. And it turns out that for someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, they are actually below the 10th percentile for both height, which is what we've drawn here, and weight. So that means that only 10% of other kids their age are shorter or weigh less than they do, and 90% of kids their age are taller and weigh more than they do. So height and weight below the 10th percentile is a physical feature that we see in people with fetal alcohol syndrome. And there's one other main sign of fetal alcohol syndrome that we'll look at here, the craniofacial abnormalities that we see in people with fetal alcohol syndrome. So to see what those are, let's pull up this face here. So there are 3 main features that we see in people with fetal alcohol syndrome. So the first is what we call a smooth philtrum. So this is the philtrum here, this area between the nose and the upper lip. So this philtrum is smoother, it's flatter in people with fetal alcohol syndrome compared to people without fetal alcohol syndrome. And the second feature that we see here is a thin vermilion. So this part of the upper lip here, this is the vermilion, so it's quite thin in people with fetal alcohol syndrome. And the last feature we see is a reduced distance between this part of the eye and this part of the eye, and we call this a short palpebral fissure length. And interestingly, with each of these features, the more alcohol that the fetus was exposed to, the more exaggerated these features are. So with more alcohol exposure, we see a flatter philtrum, a thinner vermilion, and shorter palpebral fissure length. And the more alcohol the fetus is exposed to, we know the more the brain is damaged. So that means that in a child, we can use these features not only to help us identify fetal alcohol syndrome, but also to get an idea of how bad the brain damage is, right? Because these features are more exaggerated with more alcohol exposure. So that brings us nicely to how we go about diagnosing fetal alcohol syndrome. And because we don't have a test like a blood test or a particular brain scan that we can use to confirm fetal alcohol syndrome, what we actually do is we look for these features of fetal alcohol syndrome. We look for these craniofacial features here, and we look to see if the child is under the 10th percentile for weight and height. And we look for the signs that there's some damage to the brain. So, those signs of intellectual disability, like, for example, learning and memory problems. And we would also try to take a history of mom and see if she consumed any alcohol at any point during her pregnancy. And once we know that someone has fetal alcohol syndrome, this is something that they'll have for the rest of their life. The damage to the brain is permanent. Those neurons that were lost because of exposure to alcohol, we can't get those back. So what we try to do is manage the symptoms that someone with fetal alcohol syndrome experiences. So, for example, for someone who struggles with learning, we might get them involved in a personalized education program to make sure that their individual learning skills and weaknesses are addressed. And for those disorders that can arise in someone with fetal alcohol syndrome, like, for example, seizure disorders, we might use medications to help manage these.